Good evening, everybody. I hope you are well. This season is definitely getting a little cooler. Excuse me here one second. There we go. No V-necks. Not tonight, at least. All right. Well, hey, tonight we're going a little bit more structure informed to a degree, but still obviously a lesson. But the title of the sermon is Isaiah, a story of God's loving mercy. And we're going to run through 3 points tonight. There'll be a bit of history, a few things here and there, but not overboard. But nonetheless, understanding how it is that the book is divided, the intention, the goal, the clarity, as we obviously are going to take our time moving through this book, I can tell you that you can spend a lot of time on numerous aspects of this book. And I don't know, I don't know how long you could spend here. Literally, I'm just from reading the first part that I'm doing, minimum a year. If you did any due diligence. So I'm going to do my best to summarize as we move through and deal with themes, and we'll see how it goes. But I'm impressed. Let's put it that way. I am impressed. So point 1 tonight, God has warned because he is love. God has warned because he is love. First and foremost, God has made every declaration as to his intent abundantly clear. And there is zero need to question him with regard to his plans. If you want to tomorrow, I would say spend your time in the last few chapters of John. And Jesus makes some interesting statements. You'll find the parallels in the book of James, which I guess some early theologians missed. But Jesus says very clearly that we will glorify God in our conduct, in the fruits of our lives, in essence, in works to a degree. And that the absence of those things is a declaration that we are unwilling to give God glory. And it fits part and parcel with the idea that faith without works was dead. In the same manner, when you read the book of Isaiah, keep in mind that none of these people are confused about what is expected of them. They're not confused. They took God for granted. They just flat out did not care. And they took the title of chosen to the extreme. And I think that even in the church, we can do the same thing. There's sometimes that people trip over the idea of being predestined and misunderstand that predestination is a discussion of the limits and the boundaries that have been given, and thus in the name Christian, which is those that conform to the image of Christ, we have been predestined. We have been given the boundary of what we are going to be. We've been given the limits of such things. Therefore, all who answer the call have been predestined. Doesn't eradicate free will in any way. The absence of free will complicates things significantly, but it even adds to it another element, which is we're something different than everybody else. We weren't called out of sin. We were created to come out of sin. And that becomes incredibly troublesome, that Jesus would come and die and make a declaration for all mankind, but it not be all mankind. So if you look at the Jews' behavior, the Israelites, the Hebrews, however you want to title them, they understood that there was a significant emphasis on with regard to them as far as God's attention and time. And they let it morph into something that ultimately caused them to consistently rebel. They were problematic people. They were problematic people. Point 2 tonight, the word is intended to drive us to perfection. I've heard it said, and I think it's a poor rendering of Scripture, which is this idea that God is not calling us to be perfect. Well, if he's asking us to be like Christ, then the model that we have been given is perfect. Grace comes in because clearly even in our best attempts to be perfect, we're not going to be. Many times people will have an air of pride, if you will, about how their struggles went and the difficulties they faced, and that becomes their identity. Even to the point the things that they are struggling with now or going through now becomes their identity. And in Christ, he is to be all-consuming. For the Jew, they were still keeping to certain practices that God had given them, but they were unfaithful. I mean, God gets to the point when you read chapter 1 that he brings a lawsuit against them, and he detests absolutely everything that they are doing, even those things that look to be faithful because of the condition of their heart. He's beyond annoyed. And for us, if we slow down and begin to consider what we value and what God values, I think it's important for us to recognize anything and highlight anything that doesn't fit. If God does not value it and I do, then how? And out of what? And what for? And ultimately, is it something that's going to draw me away from him if he says no? When Hebrews talks about discipline, and nobody enjoys discipline, but that God disciplines the ones that he loves. And if you are not disciplined by God, then you are illegitimate. It uses a very specific word, but you are illegitimate. It's just referencing a conversation between you and the Father in which he says no. And they happen all the time. And so as Christians, if we cannot hear the word no and we're refusing to slow down, ultimately we may be lucky enough to be sent a prophet. It's not guaranteed. Isaiah's presence among the people was a declaration of the Father's love. They were just so arrogant and so rebellious that instead of understanding that warning, that opportunity, it's literally, if you think about it, the devastation that sin brings is like a train on tracks. It is predictable. It is predictable. Sin doesn't derail in that sense, okay? It's going to meet you at a certain point. The consequence is going to barrel you over. And so God knows what road you have chosen and what you are heading towards. And to a degree, the prophet stands in the way like the arms that come down and the lights that are flashing. And it says, hey, no, no, no. This danger, Will Robinson, if you're old enough to know what I'm talking about. It was reruns when I was a kid, okay? It was reruns. I just want to make that clear. Just to be clear, I'm not old enough to have seen the original TV show. All right? But those arms are coming down, and we have the opportunity to blast through them. But the wages of sin is death, and that is for everyone. Point 3. Oop. Let's try it. My iPad, 3 fingers, you close it, 2 fingers, you move it. It's pretty neat. But point 3, God desires our restoration, we must focus on obedience. The book of Isaiah is divided into two categories. You have chapters 1 through 39, covering the judgment of God, and chapters 40 through 66, the restoration offered to the exiles. And then what's interesting is you'll see that the book, in essence, closes as it begins. And it begins as it closes. And there's a term for this in the mirroring of a writing. It is a palistrophe. Palistrophe. Palistrophes. So I think the other one is chiasmus or chiasmus. And these are literary tools. And Isaiah uses this fascinating structure, which is basically that the first part is mirrored or reversed later. And it is meant to emphasize and drive home a point. And so you see these repeating themes throughout the book. And even where, if you look at a chart, how this chapter loops to the end, and this is an answer for this, and so on and so forth. And so there's these continual connections in the book between what is written in the first part and later declared as it relates to God's intent to restore, and then it just travels through the whole book in that way. And that's why I'm saying if you took chapters from the beginning, so like you could preach your way all the way through, okay? And then you could do entire messages just about the contrast and comparison of chapters that are later mirrored, right? So you have 66 books or 66 chapters, which I guarantee there's at least 10 to 15 chapters that would need more than one lesson, right? So, I mean, it gets stretched out. It gets stretched out. So bear with me, because I as I study and pray and go through it, there's times I'm looking at something and go, ooh, wouldn't that be fun to talk about? And then everybody else goes, as in, 36 months later, we're still in Isaiah. So, I mean, maybe you're all into that. I don't know. But the American mindset has gone from TikToks to, 15-second shots on Instagram. So who knows? Who knows? So let's jump in tonight. I've got verses. I've got this. I've got that. But point one again, God warned because he is love. Judah, which is where Isaiah ministered, was not confused about the demands of God. They just basically took him for granted. And they didn't care. They didn't care. They were expelled from the promise that they had been given because they didn't keep their word. And in fact, God brings this charge against them in chapter 1 as we get to it. And it's a covenant violation. It's a covenant violation. And it's almost as if, and it's described in such a way, but it is to a degree a lawsuit that God is bringing against them, and he is going to make it known as to why it is that he is not just disappointed, but angry, and the fallout that will come. And there is this prolonged part in the judgment of God that I think for the discerning individuals, because they have done studies on this, that the more intelligent you are, the more you suffer mentally dealing with situations that others are oblivious to. And discernment's important. Discernment and pattern recognition. A lot of what I was just reading in this even mentioned the fact that the prophets, which is why I think so many people work to undermine discernment and pattern recognition, is because it is the office of the prophet that does it. It's the office of the prophet that does it. Remember, for many of these prophets, at least how they were considered, in the Old Testament that they had a supernatural view of history. So they were able to look out over the arc of human behavior and link past behavior to present behavior, and they could see the pattern unfolding as it related to, it being good or it being bad, right? But the majority of the warnings that we see from, or the majority of the prophet's influence has to do with warnings, has to do with rebukes. So they were expelled from the promise because they did not keep their word. God noted the behavior of Judah's enemies. I mean, even as it related to those that were going to hold them, God knew what they were about, and he held it against them. The thing that drew other nations, or the attention of these other nations at points to Judah and Israel, was their rebellion. I talked about it Sunday morning. If we draw near to God and he draws near to us, and we resist the devil and the devil flees, then he's able to be expelled, right? He's able to be cast out. It's not something we say in a haughty way. I challenge you not to do those kinds of things. I think it is a big mistake to pick big fights. It's not a game. It's not a game. Remember in the book of Jude, if the angel came and dealt with the enemy over the body of Moses, and yet he didn't give a railing accusation, I think that it's important that we humble ourselves before the Lord and consider how it is that through the power of the Spirit we're able to do these things. And therefore, if God has not called us into a particular conflict or empowered us to be in a certain moment, then we're there for ourselves, and ultimately the cost will be to ourselves. When God calls you into something and empowers you to go through it, you may still suffer physically. You may still, even up into the point of being put to death. However, even when there is fear, there is peace. Okay, the apostles dealt with fear. Paul dealt with fear as it related to the conduct of evil men, and they cried out to God. But the Lord kind of insulates you in those seasons and covers you. And to go in, the idea of going into conflict with the enemy in a direct fashion without the call or covering of God to do so, it's going to be bad. It's going to be bad. So God had noted the behavior of Judah's enemies. Edom at this point had already fallen. But God was not going to protect the whole of Israel from their decisions. Israel invited invasion because of disobedience, and they demanded to be enslaved because they valued sin more than obedience. You see, the blessings of God will get lost to us when we remain selfish or become selfish once again. When we embrace or value the conduct of the unrighteous, we become the enemies of God. God used Isaiah to deliver counsel, rebuke. At a point, he stops a war, saves the people, foretells the result of rebellion, and declares the intention of a loving God to a people who were hard-headed and hard-hearted. In 1 John chapter 2, 4-6, it says this: "The one who says, 'I have come to know him,' and does not keep his commandments is a liar." Okay, let me ask you a question. Jesus asks us to do things outside of ourselves, right? Like, not just in heart and mind, but heart, mind, soul, body, all of it, right? So there's no way that a relationship with Christ is just an internal conversation. It has to produce. It has to produce, okay? So in keeping his commandments, obviously we're going to go through life, have contact with others, engage with others to some degree, and it's going to demand something of us as it relates to our conduct. So if someone says, I know him, but does not keep his commandments, he is a liar, and the truth is not in him. But whoever follows his word, in him the love of God has truly been perfected. By this we know that we are in him. The one who says that he remains in him ought himself also to walk just as he walked. Point 2 tonight. The word is intended to drive us to perfection. It is a ridiculous statement that the Bible is not calling us to be perfect people. If perfection wasn't the goal, then grace wouldn't need to be. Does that make sense? Grace covers us because it is clear that we will never be perfect on this side. Okay? It is the opportunity for us to encounter a loving God and to embrace the covering that he has for us. That's all true. But when we discuss sanctification, when we discuss perfection, when we discuss these things, sometimes people have in their heart and mind that God's willing to compromise. That's what I hear when people talk like this. Which is, it's okay to keep a certain number of your sins. That's not what we just read. Right? The one who says that he remains in him, himself also, is to walk just as he walked. Means the conduct of a Christian needs to look like Christ. If Christ was not perfect, and then we have a problem. And if he was perfect, then we have a problem. If we're called to be like him, and perfection is the call, then with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, we are to love God. Right? So it should be the drive within us to come to a place where we are willing to stop sinning. And you say that's impossible. No, it's not. The word says that the one who is willing to suffer in the flesh is done with sin. Yeah. It doesn't mean we won't make mistakes, but there are mistakes we shouldn't be making again and again and again and again. All right? If you've got a problem with your language and you say things you shouldn't be saying, you need to work on that. Okay? You need to work on that. So if you have issues with rage, you need to work on that. If you can't control what you're, quote unquote, can't control what you're drawn to, you need to work on that. If you're looking at things you shouldn't be looking at, you need to work on that. And it's through the power of the Spirit that those things are accomplished. So the word is intended to drive us to perfection. Isaiah ministered in a divided kingdom. He was in Judah, and then there was Israel. His ministry was to 4 kings, Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. Tradition says, this is tradition, that Isaiah was murdered, sawn in two, by his grandson, Manasseh, who was the son of his daughter Hephzibah, who, by tradition, was married to Hezekiah. Now, Hezekiah was a good king, but his son was a pervert. Something happened. Something went wrong. Isaiah suffered because he was righteous. He took stands. He rebuked good kings, counseled good kings, and he resisted evil men. Now, for the pre-exilic books, here where we get into the weeds a little bit, you'll see that there are terms that are used. We don't go into it specifically tonight, but there are certain terminology. I don't think we do. I don't think it's in this lesson. But it makes it clear because of the use of certain terms within these books that they were written in a certain time period. And they're about the only ones I believe that contain it. Could be wrong. But Isaiah, Obadiah, and Nahum. So the form of Isaiah is believed to have taken shape early on. There are theories about it taking longer and that it is the amalgamation of different writers and so on and so forth. But I think that many of those disagreements have been resolved. And today that the book is looked more as a completed work as opposed to breaking it apart and deciding what's here and there. And I know there's some historic finds that have kind of clarified that the book early on had form, as opposed to this, what's the word I'm looking for? That it wasn't numerous writers using a surname. That's what I'll say. Isaiah is not necessarily chronological. Not in every sense. It is thematic, but you'll see different seasons at different times, and more so the lesson is an overall lesson and God relaying this. The book that's closest chronologically and thematically to Isaiah is Micah. If you have your Bibles, we'll look at two different passages. They have some slight differences here, but there's a definite mirroring in these passages. So we'll start with Isaiah chapter 2, verses 2 through 4. And if you want to hold your finger there, you can find Micah chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. You ready? Now, verses 2 through 2, chapter 2, 2 through 4 in Isaiah. Now it will come about that in the last days, the mountains of the house of God, house of the Lord, will be established as the chief of the mountains, and will be raised above the hills, and all nations will stream to it. And many peoples will come and say, "Come, let's go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, so that he may teach us about his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For the law will go out from Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem, and he will judge between the nations and will mediate for many peoples. And they will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning knives. Nation will not lift up a sword against nation, and never again will they learn war." Now to Micah, verses 1 through 3 of chapter 4. And it will come about in the last days that the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains. It will be raised up above the hills, and the peoples will stream into it. Many nations will come and say, "Come and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord and to the house of the God of Jacob, so that he may teach us about his ways and that we may walk in his paths." Sound familiar? Okay. "For from Zion will go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem, and he will judge between many peoples and render decisions for mighty distant nations. Then they will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, and never again will they train for war." All right. Now, in this, obviously, God is announcing his intent, and there's speculation as to borrowing from this or that or copying. But in any sense, it was clearly understood that the Spirit had spoken such thing, or had spoken this, and the reality of God's intent was to be made known to mankind, that there was going to be one Messiah. And when he came, the kingdom, when he finally comes, the kingdom that he seeks to establish, these things will be great. So the New Testament quotes Isaiah approximately 69 times. meaning all the blessings and warnings are relevant to today. If you want some examples for later, Romans 9:29 and Hebrews chapter 2:13a. These passages foretell the Messiah's ruling from a restored Jerusalem, and there will be peace among all nations. As I mentioned before, the book uses a couple techniques in its writing, word plays, palistrophes, chiasmus, which means that later portions of the sentence or passages, or even in the book, is basically the first part, what is written, later is mirrored or reversed, and it is meant to emphasize and drive home the point. In some way, the book concludes as it begins with chapters 65 and 66, reflecting chapter 1 and reaffirming the nature of God and the working of his plan. It is clear God knew he was dealing with a stubborn and rebellious generation. So it seems that he knew he had to say things more than once. Last point in closing. God desires our restoration. We must focus on obedience. The book of Isaiah is divided into two categories. They're kind of split up in this sense, which is this. The chapters 1 through 39 cover the impending judgment of God, but chapters 40 through 66, the restoration that is being offered to the exiles. I mentioned this earlier. For the exiles that were coming, they were the lowly, but it was about 50,000 out of this nation. So the destruction that befell Judah due to their rebellion was unimaginable, and it was a longer recovery than they expected. In our lives, we have this daily decision process that we need to go through, and it matters. Yes, God is forgiving, but if we are unyielding in our ways, he will not keep us from the consequences that we are begging to endure. Just like Judah, God had warned them, but they ultimately made the case against themselves. Our willingness to be corrected saves us from pain. It doesn't remove every struggle, but it will definitely reduce self-inflicted wounds. Honoring God isn't suffering, it's sanity. Write that down. Honoring God isn't suffering, it's sanity. Write that down. Write it down. Honoring God isn't suffering, it's sanity. In close with this, 1 Peter chapter 4, 16 through 18. But if anyone suffers as a Christian, he is not to be ashamed, but is to glorify God in this name. For it is time for judgment to begin with the household of God. And if it begins with us first, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? And if it is with difficulty that the righteous is saved, what will become of the godless man and the sinner? Listen, this is why it is important that we preach the word as it is written. If we make compromises to include people who are unwilling to leave behind their sin, and even if it's us, if we're starting to rewrite scripture because we're worried that our sin will keep us out, that's just fantasy. It's fantasy. That's a different religion that we're creating and asking God to accept it. Well, I don't have a religion. I have a relationship. Listen, y'all, I would love for that to be the case. I really, really would. But the discussion of religion is about a pattern of behavior. And if Jesus is calling us to obey his commandments daily, I would have you a bit more religious about that than declaring your relationship with him is important enough that he'll overlook your sin. That's crazy talk. You understand that, right? Do you know how many times I hear that from people who are in rebellion? Well, I don't have a religion. I have a relationship. I pray you are down the line with the word. I really do. I want a relationship with God. I pursue a relationship with God, but I don't assume that my relationship with him, and I used to think the other way, okay? I'm telling you, I used to think more like the things I'm discussing is bad. I used to look at life a bit more like that. I don't. The more I've gotten into the Word and the more I've studied, the more I realize kind of how garbage I am. I mean, maybe you don't want to hear that tonight, but the greater he is in your understanding, the more you begin to pale in comparison in every way. There's just no comparison. And if he has given me value, then the only thing I can truly value and actually love the people around me is him. That's it. That's it. Anything else is just, it's a mess. It's a mess. So I am praying for you. I love you. I'll see you Sunday morning, 11:15. Let me look real quick here. Yeah, we'll be in chapter 1. Isn't that great? We'll be in chapter 1 of Isaiah. Right now, I will tell you that I have verse 1 through 4, and I'm trying to decide how far I'm going. You say, you don't have them all written yet? No, not all the time. There are times that I pray through it, I'm reading it, and I'm like, man, I don't know. Oh, that term, I did open the lesson. It's in this one. It is HZON in Hebrew. That was the term that was used as it relates to vision that links all the pre-exilic books, I believe. So anyway, wasn't that great? I'll see you Sunday, 11:15, Eagles Lodge. Stop looking at me like that. See you later.